Welcome back to another deep dive. We are super glad you're here, especially if you're the kind of learner who is, always hungry for that shortcut to being really well informed, but without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're aiming for today. We've got a really great source text to get into.
We do. We are looking at an excerpt focused on accountability and community,
Mm.
and is basically exploring this hidden architecture of spiritual growth.
Right, the stuff you don't really see on the surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because, modern culture pretty much tells you that the ultimate sign of maturity is the lone wolf, right?
Oh, absolutely, the self-made person.
Right. We are just constantly bombarded with this image of the person who summits the mountain of life entirely alone.
Yeah.
And we've internalized this idea that personal and especially spiritual growth is just a solo sport. Like you just need the right gear, enough willpower, maybe a really highly optimized morning routine.
A good aesthetic journal.
Yes, a good journal, and you are set. But okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission today is discovering why the ultimate life hack for personal transformation might actually just be, other people.
What's fascinating here is that modern culture totally celebrates this independence. But according to our source, the quote-unquote lone Christian is a complete myth.
A total myth.
Yeah, it fundamentally sabotages the exact growth that people are, desperately looking for. We are just so conditioned by the culture to view independence as strength
Right.
that we miss this glaring reality. The text argues that the greatest barrier to your transformation isn't a lack of knowledge.
It's not about reading more books.
No, not at all. It isn't that you haven't listened to enough lectures or consumed enough content. The absolute greatest barrier is a lack of connection.
Which, if we're being completely honest, feels incredibly counterintuitive.
It does.
Because isolation feels safer. I mean, when you are alone, you
Yeah.
completely control the narrative.
Oh, 100%. You don't have to be vulnerable.
Exactly. You don't have to deal with the messy, unpredictable nature of other people. But thinking you can achieve deep spiritual transformation by yourself is kind of like trying to learn a new language alone in your bedroom.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, you can sit there with flashcards for 5 years. You can memorize all the grammar rules.
You might even have perfect pronunciation.
Right. But until you pack your bags, move to a foreign country, and you are forced to, navigate a bustling market, haggling over the price of bread in that language.
We aren't fluent.
You're not. You're just full of theoretical data. You need the immersion, the awkward stumbling, and the actual friction of interacting with locals to absorb the language into your reflexes.
Yeah, that immersion forces you out of theory and into immediate practice. And in spiritual terms, without that relational friction, your faith just remains entirely theoretical.
That's just head knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might have all the right answers intellectually intact, but your practical obedience weakens because it's never actually tested in the real world. And when your character is never tested by the presence of others, the human heart defaults to its most dangerous habit, which is rationalization.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the text points out that sin and spiritual drift, they rarely present themselves honestly.
No, they don't.
Like, they don't kick down your front door and announce, hi, I'm here to systematically ruin your life.
That would be too easy.
Right. Instead, they creep in through very subtle justifications. You start telling yourself, I'm not being arrogant, I'm just highly principled.
Or I'm not isolating myself, I'm just protecting my peace.
Yes, protecting my peace. We hear that one all the time.
We really do. And the human mind has this terrifyingly efficient ability to justify unhealthy patterns when it's left to its own devices. You basically become both the judge and the defendant in your own internal courtroom.
And surprise, surprise, you always acquit yourself.
Right, because there's no opposing counsel. You need an outside perspective. You need a trusted friend to act as a spiritual mirror.
Wow, a spiritual mirror.
Yeah, because isolation is this fertile ground where denial and shame thrive, simply because there is no one there to reflect reality back to you. When you're alone, your blind spots remain completely hidden, precisely because they are blind spots.
So if this solo act is so detrimental to our psychology and our growth, why do we keep defaulting to it? What went wrong?
Well, to understand that, the text says we have to look at the original blueprint for human life.
Okay.
We have to go all the way back to Genesis 2.18. God looks at humanity and declares, "It is not good that the man should be alone."
And the timing of that is huge.
The timing is everything. This declaration happens before the fall.
Wow.
Before sin, before brokenness, before any corruption even enters the world. Adam was living in a perfect environment, experiencing direct, untainted fellowship with God, and yet God still looks at the situation and says, isolation is not good.
That is wild to think about.
It reveals this foundational truth that human beings were designed for relational life from their very inception. And the text traces this back to the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Okay, unpacking that a bit.
Yeah, basically, because God exists eternally in perfect relational communion, reality itself is woven with a relational architecture.
Relational architecture. Let's ground that a bit, because that can sound a little abstract.
Sure.
I like to think of it like trying to breathe underwater. If you try to live a completely solitary life in a universe that was explicitly built by a relational God, you are essentially fighting the fundamental physics of your environment.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
You aren't just being antisocial, you're trying to operate a complex machine totally contrary to its original design. Of course it's going to break down.
Right. That friction people feel when they try to go it alone, it isn't just a personality quirk. It is an ontological clash with reality.
Oh, I like that.
And this brings us to that famous imagery the source highlights from Ecclesiastes chapter 4. The whole idea that two are better than one, and the metaphor of the cord of three strands that isn't quickly broken.
Right, the threefold cord.
Yeah. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, that threefold cord is actually a masterclass in relational theology. The three strands aren't just, you and two buddies hanging out watching a game.
Right, it's deeper than that.
Much deeper. The text specifically defines them as believer one, believer two, and God at the very center.
Which shifts the dynamic entirely. It means it's not just a social club where you validate each other's feelings and vent about your week.
Exactly. When God is that central strand binding the relationship together, the divine presence transforms the friendship into a protective guardrail. The mechanics change entirely.
How so?
Well, correction is suddenly motivated by love and aligned with objective truth rather than just a subjective opinion. Encouragement draws from a shared transcendent faith, not just temporary optimism.
That makes a lot of sense.
That third strand provides the ultimate resilience against the pressures of life. It holds the other two together when human willpower inevitably fails.
Okay, so understanding this theological blueprint is one thing. The theory sounds flawless. But seeing it actually applied is another.
Right. What does it look like on the ground?
Exactly. And if we look at the ultimate model for this, which would be Jesus, his approach to discipleship was highly layered.
Very intentional.
Yeah. He didn't just broadcast a message to the masses and hope people figured it out. According to the text, he spoke to the massive crowds. Then he commissioned a smaller group of 72 for specific work. Then he invested deeply in the 12 disciples.
And even within that 12...
Right. Even within that inner circle, he had an absolute core of just 3, Peter, James, and John.
And those 3 were the only ones brought into the most intense, intimate moments of his ministry. They were present at the Transfiguration, which was this moment of terrifying, overwhelming divine glory. And they were the ones he pulled close in the Garden of Gethsemane, which was a moment of crushing, almost unimaginable human despair. He purposefully brought them into the extremes of his experience.
Stuff the crowds never saw.
Exactly. Allowing them to witness things the crowds and even the other 9 disciples never saw.
But I have to push back on this a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
So, Jesus intentionally didn't give everyone equal access. Doesn't that directly challenge our modern, democratic mass consumption idea of faith?
Oh, it totally challenges it.
Because today, the ideal scenario for so many people is just slipping into the back row of a megachurch auditorium, sitting totally anonymously in a crowd of thousands, absorbing a great message, sipping a coffee, and just slipping out to the parking lot without ever having a real conversation.
Yeah, we love the crowd because it demands absolutely nothing of us.
Exactly.
But this layered model completely dismantles that modern notion. Jesus understood a fundamental reality of human psychology, which is that the crowds inspire, but the small circles transform.
Wow. The crowds inspire, but the small circles transform.
Right. You cannot deeply mentor a multitude. Spiritual formation requires proximity. It requires shared life. You have to observe how someone reacts to stress, eat meals together, experience trials side by side.
Yeah.
The back row of the auditorium might give you a burst of emotional inspiration or intellectual stimulation, but it completely lacks the relational friction required to actually change your character. Inspiration fades, but character remains.
Which makes perfect sense when you look at history. The figures who sustained long, impactful lives didn't rely on the crowd to keep them grounded.
No, they didn't.
The text points to Charles Spurgeon, the famous 19th century preacher. He was speaking to thousands every week in Victorian London. But the sheer weight of his ministry and all the poverty he dealt with, it led to severe bouts of depression.
Yeah, he struggled deeply.
You did. But he actively relied on a tight pastoral network. He didn't just have acquaintances. He built a structured brotherhood that functioned as an early warning system for his own physical and spiritual burnout.
And Billy Graham is another perfect historical proof of this concept from the text.
Oh yeah, the Modesto Manifesto.
Exactly. He preached to millions across the globe. But early in his ministry, he and his core team recognized the extreme danger of their visibility.
Right.
So they sat down in a hotel room in Modesto, California, and established these strict, non-negotiable, moral, financial, and relational boundaries.
They explicitly agreed to hold each other accountable, right?
Yes, to very specific standards. Rules like never being alone with a woman other than their wives, absolute financial transparency, because they recognize that extreme visibility does not equal accountability.
If anything, it's the opposite.
Right. Extreme visibility often creates a dangerous bubble of isolation. They intentionally built that threefold cord around themselves because they knew the crowd couldn't protect them from their own blind spots.
So if visibility couldn't protect someone like Billy Graham, it basically proves the crowd isn't enough. It's what happens away from the crowd that matters.
Exactly.
So what are the actual mechanics of this? What is happening inside those small circles that prevents a person from drifting?
Well, we find the mechanism in the book of James, chapter 5, verse 16. It commands believers to confess their sins to one another and pray for one another so that they may be healed.
Huh?
Notice the causality there. Healing is directly, inextricably linked to confession and mutual prayer.
But let's be honest, the word confess carries a massive amount of baggage for most people.
Oh, huge baggage.
Yeah, it conjures up images of like dark booths, harsh judgment, or being forced to wear a scarlet letter. It feels like an act of humiliation, not healing.
And that means we have deeply misunderstood the psychology of confession.
How so?
It's not about shame or punishment at all. It is a highly effective tool designed to break the power of secrecy.
Secrecy.
Right. Sin, addiction, deep psychological struggles, they all thrive in the dark. They feed on this illusion that you are the only one dealing with this problem.
Yeah, that isolating feeling.
Exactly. And the burden of maintaining a double life just exhausts the soul. But the moment you vocalize that struggle in the presence of a trusted, loving friend, it loses its grip.
The secrecy is shattered.
Yes. Confession is reframed here from an act of humiliation into a pathway for true psychological and spiritual healing. It literally changes your brain's relationship to the secret.
Which brings us to the lone coal analogy from the text, which I think is probably the most vivid visual for this entire deep dive.
It's a great metaphor.
Right. So for you listening, imagine a roaring fire in a fireplace. All the coals are glowing bright red, feeding off each other's ambient heat.
Right.
If you take a pair of tongs, pull one glowing coal out, and set it on the cold hearth all by itself, well, what happens?
And it doesn't stay hot.
No. It rapidly cools down, it turns gray, it goes completely dark. But the exact second you push that cold coal back into the pile of other coals, it reignites.
It catches fire again simply by being in proximity to the heat of the others, because you cannot sustain your own heat in isolation. The laws of thermodynamics don't allow it, and the laws of spiritual formation don't either.
That's powerful.
And the early church understood this deeply. They modeled this reigniting process through a practice captured by the Greek word koinonia. We usually translate that as fellowship.
But let's clarify that, because modern fellowship usually just means drinking lukewarm coffee in a church basement and chatting about the weather or the local sports team.
Precisely. Koinonia was much heavier and far more demanding than that. It was deep, mutual participation in each other's lives.
Like sharing resources and bearing emotional burdens.
Yes, and engaging in a very specific rhythm of interaction. This rhythm basically consisted of 4 pillars: gratitude, growth, struggle, and prayer.
Okay, break those down for us.
Sure. Gratitude anchors the group in what God is actively doing, which prevents cynicism. Growth highlights spiritual progress and keeps everyone moving forward rather than just dwelling on the negative. Struggle is that crucial moment of vulnerability and confession we just discussed. And prayer is the spiritual engine that ties it all together, inviting God's power to do what human advice cannot.
Okay, so this sounds amazing, But how do you actually build this kind of transformational ecosystem in a modern, overwhelmingly busy life?
That is the big question.
Because you can't just walk up to a stranger at the grocery store and demand koinonia, right? You have to build it intentionally.
This raises an important question about group dynamics. It starts with creating the right environment. The research and historical practice suggests the sweet spot for a discipleship group is 3 to 6 people.
Why that specific number?
Well, if the group gets larger than that, the introverts start to hide, the extroverts dominate the conversation, and overall vulnerability drops.
And if it's too small?
If it's just 2 people, you might lack the necessary diversity of perspective.
Hmm.
And within that small group of 3 to 6, you have to fiercely balance 2 elements, grace and truth.
Because truth without grace is just harsh judgment.
It crushes people.
Yeah, it makes them defensive and closes them off. But grace without truth is permissive indifference. It's like watching someone drive a car toward a cliff and smiling at them because you just don't want to make things awkward.
Exactly. You need the friction of truth to sharpen someone, but the safety of grace so they don't break in the process. It is a very delicate balance.
So how do we find that balance?
To help establish this without it blowing up, the source lays out a very practical 30-day accountability plan. It's a structured approach to building this kind of relationship from scratch.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go ahead.
A 30-day accountability plan sounds like a stiff corporate performance review. Like, hey guys, let's sit down and review our Q3 spiritual KPIs. Did we synergize our prayer paradigms this week?
Yeah, that does sound awful.
It feels completely unnatural and robotic for a real friendship.
It definitely sounds robotic if you view it through a corporate lens, but think of it more like physical therapy after a major surgery. When you first start walking again, it is highly structured. You do specific exercises for specific amounts of time because your muscles have completely atrophied. The structure isn't there to make you a robot. It is there to rebuild the muscle safely.
Ah, I see.
Let's break down the 4 weeks. Week 1 is simply about establishing connection and sharing spiritual goals. You aren't diving into your deepest, darkest secrets yet. You are just setting a baseline.
You're building the foundation of the house before you try to put the roof on. You're just figuring out what you actually want to work on.
Exactly. Then, week 2 is about cultivating honesty. This is where you practice open conversation about your day-to-day struggles.
Which is hard for people.
Incredibly hard. You are actively building the muscle of vulnerability, which is difficult for most of us who are used to projecting perfection. You need the safety established in week 1 to make the honesty of week 2 possible.
Then week 3 shifts the momentum, right? It focuses on encouraging growth. This is where you share testimonies, answered prayers, and basically celebrate the wins.
Yeah.
You are reigniting the coal. You're looking at the progress and saying, hey, this friction is actually working.
And finally, week 4 is for evaluating, reflecting, and strengthening the bonds. You look back at the month and ask, how did we do? Where do we need to adjust? What worked and what didn't? It's a time for honest feedback on the process itself.
So the structure isn't meant to be a permanent rigid cage. It's scaffolding.
That is the perfect way to look at it. When you are constructing a building, you need scaffolding to hold things up until the internal structure can bear its own weight.
Right.
This 30-day framework is just relational scaffolding. It supports your vulnerability until honesty and accountability become a natural breathing habit in your friendships. Once the muscle memory is there, you don't need the rigid 30-day schedule anymore. It just becomes who you are.
That is incredibly helpful. Let's synthesize all of this. What we've discovered from this deep dive is that spiritual isolation is incredibly fragile. The lone Christian is a myth that leaves you vulnerable to self-deception, shame, and a slow, silent drift away from your true goals.
Yeah, you just can't grow in a vacuum.
You can't breathe underwater, and you can't grow in a vacuum. But faith, woven together with trusted friends and with God at the center, forms an unbreakable threefold cord. So I want to ask you, the listener, directly. Who currently knows the real state of your spiritual life?
It's a tough question.
It is. Not the polished public version you show at work or at social gatherings. Who knows the honest, messy reality of your struggles and your victories? If the answer is no one, you are operating that language app alone in your room. It is time to seek out the friction of immersion.
And I would leave you with this final thought to mull over. We constantly avoid deep spiritual accountability because we are terrified of interpersonal friction.
Yeah, we hate it.
We don't want the awkwardness. We don't want the pushback. But if isolation is the absolute greatest enemy of your spiritual growth, What if the very friction, frustration, uncomfortable vulnerability that you are trying so hard to avoid in relationships, what if that is actually the exact tool God is using to shape your character?